What feels like day 10 zillion of self-quarantine, but we're hoping to meet you exactly where you all are. This is Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez coming at you from the Bronx, New York. We are having our kind of second installment of this little experimental coffee and conversation series that we've got going on. I actually didn't even get my coffee today. We should call this like tea. We should maybe call it chai and conversation, because I don't know if I should be having coffee at 7 p.m. But anyway, point is that today and what this series is all about is just for us to have a casual conversation between you all and us. We're having constituents. If you are a constituent of New York's 14th Congressional District, please feel free to call in. I will be taking call in and caller questions so we can talk one-on-one. Hopefully this is a little less intimidating than a town hall where you have to stand up in front of a big group of people or a large Zoom of people, but really just have a conversation about what's been going on. Any questions that you have, whether it's about healthcare, whether it's about how we're responding to this crisis, the future, any of it, I'm happy to kind of just sit down and talk to you all and just chop it up. And so this is kind of a Zoom chat or a Facebook live chat meets a radio call-in show. We found that this format's been really good. So I'll try to stop filibustering. Let's get straight to it. If you are a constituent of New York's 14th Congressional District, the call-in number is 347-502-6815. Again, that is 347-502-6815. And we're really happy to kind of talk about this. We can talk about a wide range of issues. I will kick things off this evening to talk a little bit about what's going on locally in terms of mutual aid. And mutual aid is a concept. It's an organizing concept, but it's something that we've been seeing out here in the community and in the streets, because while there's a whole bunch of federal policy and a whole bunch of city and state policy that's getting passed, at the end of the day, there are still huge gaps and cracks and fissures in that policy, and people are falling through. And what we believe in really is just having a mode and believing in movement politics that addresses all of us, both in public policy and outside of public policy. And that's where mutual aid comes in. I think in the month of April, towards the end of April, I wound down and rolled down pretty much, we paused our campaign contributions and began rolling them over directly to relief efforts here in our community. So we've now raised over $300,000 to food banks and other organizing COVID relief efforts here in New York 14 and across New York City. And so I'm thrilled that we've been able to accomplish that, because especially to all of our brothers and sisters and neighbors that are celebrating Ramadan right now, where that is a day that ends with a beautiful iftar, a large meal to help break the fast. Now more than ever, we can't afford New Yorkers to be going hungry. And so this is something that is so important to all of us. So we've been having mutual aid organizations come in. They're paired with our folks here on the ground with food banks to help make sure that we're feeding families, that families are getting meals that they need, in addition to all of the big policy moves that we're trying to make. So that being said, let's kick it over to Marjorie Velasquez from Throg's Neck. Marjorie, are you ready to ask a question?
Yes. Hi, how are you? And thank you for not only representing us, but representing us well in Congress. And one of the things that we've been seeing here in the district since early March, I have been out there with the mutual aid, and it started off small, and now every week it gets larger and larger, and the stories get greater and greater, and it's a little tough emotionally. Every night you just go home thinking about how blessed it is that you have a roof over your head and food on the table and a loved one with you. And unfortunately, our families are going hungry. We live in the Bronx, so New York 14 is the epicenter. And you have some folks, especially in the immigrant communities, that literally, without these meals, they do not eat at all for the week. And it is humbling, to say the least. And so when it comes to forward thinking, right, because what we're looking at, it's pretty serious. And what we're considering is, you know what, we are their lifeline for now, but what is the future? And when we are looking at the future, what plans do we have in mind for the future? So how do we manage these current needs of our community when it comes to food and PPE, while also building support systems for the future that we really need as well?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is the question. And Marjorie, thank you for all the work that you're doing out in Throgs Neck. It is so needed and so necessary. And it's a lot of, what you've been talking about is a very real thing, even for folks who are stepping up to help and collecting meals and getting them out. Not only is that, an exhausting job in and of itself, but even all of our folks on the front line, whether you're a frontline worker or a frontline volunteer, there's just a huge emotional toll to all of this that we have to say out loud and that we have to articulate. And whether you're directly impacted or whether you're in the service work, it is intensely emotional because there's so much trauma that people are experiencing right now, whether it's the trauma of not knowing if you're going to make your rent next month, or the trauma of not being able to feed yourself, or just the trauma of being exposed to so much of that. We need to really name that. And so I hope I'm glad you're acknowledging the emotional dynamic here, but I hope you're taking care of yourself and that you're taking that time to take care of yourself, because that's how we can do this in the long haul. And speaking of the long haul, what this really needs to be about is policy, in that you're exactly right. We're here, we're doing everything we can as a community to come together, to feed each other, to source meals, but we need to have, that's the short-term plan. The long-term plan is how do we structure things so that people aren't going hungry and that they aren't afraid to go to the hospital. I think one of the things that that's a part of that, a lot of them are policies that we have been championing. We are long past the time to guarantee healthcare in the United States. That's level one. Because when we get to a point where we're struggling to afford a meal, or when we're struggling to feel economic security or material security, it's because all of these things are chipping away at us. It's healthcare, it's student loans, it's rent, it's the high cost of housing and the high cost of living, and all of that. It's immigration status. And so all of this is systemic. And so I think when it comes down to the crisis, there's three major things we need to hit upon. One is wages and income. The other is healthcare, overall healthcare. And the third, I think here, at least in New York City, is housing. Those are three major things that we need to hit upon. One, when it comes to healthcare, everyone knows that I'm a strong proponent of Medicare for all, because I believe that we need to guarantee healthcare in the United States. The average family can incur anywhere up to $10,000 a year in healthcare expenses. And for our families, it's just not doable to pay $10,000 a year in insulin and all of this. And that's modest compared to what a lot of families have to deal with. We need to address the housing crisis in New York City. And that goes for both renters and small mom and pop landlords that we have here. We are on the precipice of a housing crisis. And right now, there's 30 million people that have just gone on unemployment, or rather, not even gone on unemployment, have become unemployed. And a lot of people might say, oh, well, they're collecting unemployment, they should be able to pay the rent. There are so many people that have not been able to get through the unemployment lines, get a call back, get on the roll correctly, that this is actually becoming a systemic issue that is starting to destabilize our housing market. So we need to get housing under control. We need to get healthcare under control. And of course, we need to make sure that then we need to get wages and income under control. There are people that are, there's some folks that are saying, oh, well, some people are making unemployment, more money on unemployment than they do going back to their job at this present point in time. Because remember, there's an emergency supplemental to help people get through in this moment. This is not the normal circumstance with unemployment. But even so, that supplemental is pegged to $15 an hour. And when you have the combination of all of these things, when your healthcare is super expensive, when your rent is skyrocketing, and you're not being paid enough to live, you put a pandemic on top of that, and everything just starts to fall apart. And so really the best way to move forward together is in these broader progressive policies. So I think that those are some of the things we need to organize for. And by the way, we need to organize it in a way that people are not left behind. One of the biggest pieces of resistance that I'm hearing to relief packages, even from Democrats, other Democrats in the party, is we don't want to include immigrants. We don't want to include relief for undocumented people or people without green cards in relief. But here's the problem. About half of farm workers in the United States are undocumented. So you go to the store, and you touch a tomato and you touch romaine lettuce and you bring it to your house and you chop it up. Half of the food you bring into your house was touched by undocumented hands if it was procured in the United States, which means we need to ask ourselves, are we okay with excluding half of the people who feed us and who touch our food and who are responsible for feeding this country? Are we okay with excluding them from protections from this virus? Are we okay risking them showing up to work sick as they produce our food supply chain? I mean, even from the most selfish perspective, if that's what it takes, that's what it takes. That just goes to show how interconnected we all are. And by the way, they pay taxes. I say this all the time because people don't know. They pay more taxes, more billions of dollars in taxes than many corporations do. So it just makes sense. But long term, we need to address healthcare, housing, wages, and we need to make sure that we do it in a way that's not means tested, where there's all these Swiss holes that people fall through and their problems aren't addressed. So thank you, Marjorie. And thank you for your work in mutual aid here in the Bronx. It's so needed. So let's move on to Mumita. Mumita from Jamaica.
Can you?
Okay, I think I can hear you now.
Hi, thank you so much, Congresswoman, for having me. I'm so excited to talk to you and listen. Should I guess like my question, I'll go into my question real quick. So I started the Queens Mutual Aid Network, and we're really proud that it's led by women. Most of our dispatchers are all women from diverse backgrounds, and we're really proud to support communities that are impacted by this the most. And I'm talking about Jackson Heights, Corona, Jamaica, Ozone Park, areas that haven't really gotten much support from the government or from community organizations because there's a lack of structure there. And so I just also want to thank your campaign for really like helping us and working with us to provide mutual aid to people, especially in Corona. And there's this idea that people who need help are so desperate that they'll eat whatever the city provides for them, as long, if it's free. But then we as mutual aid people, dispatchers realize that the free meal systems that the city's providing are just not designed for people who are impacted by this virus. So elderly people who might have gastro diseases or like a compromised stomach, or people who are, from other ethnic backgrounds or religious or cultural backgrounds, or just people who simply don't have access to a computer, do not have an email address. And this means immigrants, because many of our immigrant communities don't speak English and they don't have this access. So a lot of what we're doing as a mutual aid network is making sure that we're translating things for people, that we're signing them up for an email address, and we're doing our best to sign them up for other programs because we don't have enough money to continue to feed them. And unfortunately, the response from the city, the meals that they do provide and deliver to folks have been so inadequate. Like, we've had people send military rations. We've had people complain that they just got like a PB&J sandwich and applesauce, and that was it. And I just feel like we have a, I don't know, like a lot of we have to provide a dignified meal to our folks. And we're proud that we're providing fresh vegetables to everybody. And I guess my question is, because the city is often not providing adequate meals to those in need, what can the city do to provide healthy and dignified meals and help remove the stigma around asking for assistance?
Yeah, you bring up such an important issue, and this is an issue that I'm starting to hear from advocates on the ground, because I am also starting to hear from some activists and some organizers out in Brooklyn as well, that there may be inequities in the meals themselves that are being handed out. Like, and again, we have to go back and verify, but we're hearing folks from communities saying, listen, there's this kind of meal of this kind of quality that's being handed out in Bed-Stuy, but there's a totally different caliber and quality of meal being handed out elsewhere. And I think this kind of speaks to the current system of meal provision that's happening right now. It seems like there's just a bunch of contractors, and because all sorts of people are getting all sorts of different meals, it doesn't seem standardized. And some of the meals are hot meals, which I think is great for a lot of folks who need hot meals. But right now in this pandemic, with so many people that are caught indoors, it may be more helpful for us to provide staples, which is what a lot of mutual aid organizations and what we've been able to do either with Queens Mutual Aid, Bronx Mutual Aid, or even with just the food pantry delivery drop-offs that we've been helping out with in the campaign. And in some ways that may go even longer, for a lot of people, a bag of jasmine rice, for example, can last a lot longer because you're not handing over prepared meals. People are able to prepare it in a way that meets their health needs, where it meets their cultural understandings, their cultural needs, especially during Ramadan, but really for any community and any culture across the year. So I think on one hand, the actual provision of staple foods and making that a little bit broader in distribution would probably be better. Although, of course, some people may need a hot meal, and for those folks who need a hot meal, that we can find ways for that to continue. But it does seem, from what I've been seeing, the mutual aid efforts compared to just the daily hot meal provisions, folks seem to like what mutual aid efforts do, because they get the raw materials and they know how to take care of themselves. When it comes to destigmatizing asking for assistance, this is a huge this is a huge effort, and I think a lot of it always happens with our most trusted spaces. It can be very intimidating, or even just a lot of families and communities don't even know, due to that language barrier, the resources that are available or what will happen. Because with the current administration's public charge rule, a lot of our immigrant families are afraid to ask for help because they don't know if it will put them on a list. And that list could segment them for they're afraid that could put them on a fast track for deportation or having a visa denied or any of that. And so because of all of that, just anti-immigrant rhetoric and policy on the federal level, it's making things harder for us on the ground, which is why I think organizing in very trusted spaces with trusted people in our community, whether they are imams, whether they are rabbis, whether they are local pastors, in communities like Corona, especially for Latino communities in Corona, pastors of Spanish churches are very trusted entities, just like any other faith, just like any other house of faith. And so I think really tuning into those communities is extraordinarily important, but we do need to really start gathering data on what kind of food and provisions are more helpful, how many people really need a hot meal versus how many people are taking a hot meal because it's the only thing. How many people would prefer having a grocery bag dropped off. All of these things are things that we can do as a city. But again, we're going to really have to focus on the long-term effort here. And that's where I think federal policy comes in. So thank you so much. And thank you for your work, Mumita. It is so needed. And I know so many families are getting assistance because you're out there organizing. So thank you. And thank you for everyone in Queens Mutual Aid. All right, thank you, Mumita. All right, so let's move on to Alyssa from Pelham Parkway.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well, how are you?
I'm doing okay, thank you. Thank you for running this and for having me on. My question is a little bit more general. I was getting concerned about the U.S. Postal Service losing money, and I wanted to know if there's anything Congress can do to help them be more viable.
Yeah, no, thank you. This is such an important question, especially as a lot more states are relying on mail-in elections and ballots and voting, but really just the Postal Service in general is such a critical resource to our community and our country. And we have struggles here in our backyard with services. You're out in Pelham, I'm in Parkchester. Postal Service can sometimes have its bumps and difficulties. And a lot of it sometimes has to do with being under-resourced. So I think the first thing that's really important for people to understand is that the crisis around the Postal Service is completely unnecessary. The Postal Service is not in danger because they have been financially irresponsible. The Postal Service is not in danger because not enough people use it or people don't want to use it. The Postal Service is actually one of the most popular agencies across the board in the country. On average, it's more popular than almost any other agency. So that's really important. The Postal Service is widely used, and the Postal Service serves every single zip code in the United States. You can't say that about UPS. You can't say that about FedEx. You can't say that about DHL or anybody else. In fact, what a lot of these other businesses sometimes do is that if someone lives in a place that is unprofitable to deliver to, they will take it as far as they deem profitable, and then they actually pay the postage and dump it in so that the Postal Service delivers it the final leg. And so it's really important that we know that the reason the Postal Service is in danger is not because of any particularly large, like fiscal irresponsibility issue. It comes back to the fact that in the early 2000s, there was this horrible bill that Congress passed that required the Postal Service to fully fund the pensions of every single worker, like 50 years out or many, many decades out. This does not apply to any business. This barely applies to almost any other agency, because the way most other entities work is that you are required to have your pension funds that you're going to pay out maybe 3-5 years in advance. But essentially, if you're 29 years old and you are a pensioned employee, Congress has required the Postal Service to have that 29-year-old's full pension already paid in a lockbox, can't use it for anything else. It makes no sense. And that is not something that the postal office chose. It's a requirement that Congress put in. And why did Congress put it in? Well, one can only imagine, but let's just say there've been a lot of private interests that have wanted to see the Postal Service failed for a long time. And so the Postal Service is put in an impossible situation, and it's through no fault of their own. So the way that we make the Postal Service viable, one major step is quite simple, is to undo this insane, full, like decades out pre-funding pension scheme. If you get rid of that, you can solve a lot of the Postal Service's issues and go a long way towards that. But the other thing that we should be doing right now as well is that we should be considering the expansion of the kinds of services that the Postal Service offers. We should be piloting, for example, postal banking in communities and allow the Postal Service to engage in certain very simple banking services like check cashing and other similar services. Because without a public alternative to that, a lot of families have to deal with extremely high check cashing rates, or, for example, remittances. That's the word I'm looking for. Remittances when they want to send money to family. And so these are very easy, simple transactions that the Postal Service could easily expand into and quickly become viable, in addition to into many other ideas. But basically, it can come down to those two things. One is eliminate the pension requirement, and that will go a very long way in helping the Postal Service remain solvent. And the second is expand the amount of services that the post office is authorized to conduct, and allow it to continue to be the public service that it has always been for people in this country. So it's a very critical issue. Thank you for asking it, because this is something that we have to be paying attention to. It's too important for us to lose. Okay, let's move on. Let's see. So thank you again, Alyssa, for your question. It's so important. I'd also like to give a quick shout out to BronxNet before we move on to our next call. We sort of did this whole situation live, this whole call-in hour live for the first time last week. And now this week, BronxNet has reached out, and they are going to be broadcasting our little live stream on local access on channel 70 Optimum in the Bronx. So if you're in BronxNet, or you can go online, just go to bronxnet.tv. You can see this live stream all over the world in addition to Facebook. So shout out to BronxNet, shout out to local programming. We're on TV. So there we go. So let's move on to Brian from College Point. I think you have a question. Brian, are you on the line?
Hi, yeah. It's a real pleasure.
No, pleasure's all mine. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So prior to the pandemic, I was working as a service provider on Rikers, primarily with either detained or incarcerated young men. And I was furloughed as a result of COVID. So I feel like this is evidence of the hit Rikers is taking. Mm-hmm. And as bad as the conditions were, like they're worse now. And so would you speak to what like Congress can and ought to be doing to reform the criminal justice system, and like more specifically where the conversation is at right now with the pandemic and, protecting the lives of these people who can't protect themselves?
Thank you so much for asking this question. It's such an important one because there is so much that we can be doing. First of all, as we know, and as this theme keeps coming up, is that coronavirus has essentially been taking all of these pre-existing crises that we've had and just made them 10 times worse. I'm sure working and having familiarity with Rikers and just anybody who's had any sort of contact or firsthand experience with our criminal justice system and our system of mass incarceration, there's kind of like long been this phenomenon known as the jail flu or prison cold. And essentially, even before coronavirus, if you came in to visit or if you came in and had any sort of contact on the inside of a facility, of a jail or a prison, a lot of people just end up getting a cold or getting sick in the days after. And it just goes to speak to how prisons and jails are petri dishes, whether it's a common cold or whether it's something as bad as coronavirus. The inside conditions of a facility are almost designed for the transmission of disease. And when it comes to coronavirus, you have people who are packed in to tight quarters. They don't have access to hand sanitizer. Oftentimes, they don't have sufficient access to soap. They don't have the ability to social distance. Oh, and by the way, 90+% of the people have not been found guilty of a crime. And so the first thing that we need to do in terms of public health policy is pursue decarceral policy and find out, how many people are really, really just examining our conditions rather inside these prisons and jails in the first place. They are very inhumane. And to that, sometimes a lot of people, I hear concerns about, well, what do you do if you have an alternative to incarceration? What does that mean? And what I try to tell people is that the long-term solution, we want to talk about the big picture. The long-term solution to basically kind of like an abolitionist or a more abolitionist vision of our society where we're not jailing people or constantly jailing people is to just treat the Bronx or treat your neighborhood the same way that an affluent suburb would be treated, right? You go to an affluent suburb, the schools are fully funded in a way where children have plenty of opportunity. People are given so many alternatives to incarceration, whether it's community service or other almost naturally restorative justice ways of people to kind of right their wrongs. And there's plenty of economic and social opportunity so that people aren't committing crimes of desperation that put them in a place where they're being incarcerated in the first place. That's the big picture in how we get out of this. But in terms of what Congress is doing right now, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, who I'm very proud to work with, has been leading the charge and making sure that we are demanding elderly clemency and that we are trying to get as many people out of these jails and prisons as humanly possible in this moment, in a way that has a plan and in a way that is orderly. And so that first thing is making sure that we are releasing people on elderly clemency. There are people in Rikers and in jails and prisons across the country that are infirm. They're 70, 80, 90 years old, and they have been incarcerated for their entire lives. Many of them are not able to do basic things without physical assistance. And those people deserve the dignity of clemency, especially since elderly folks are so much more at risk in this moment. The other thing that we should be doing is pausing arrests for low-level offenses across the country so that we aren't arresting people on small offenses that are, in the large scheme of things, not worth risking their death for pretrial detention. And the third thing is also reducing pretrial detention as much as possible in this moment. I also think it's important for us to also talk about another population of people who are being detained right now, which is our immigrant population. There are so many people in ICE detention centers. People in our community are kept in about 3 different ICE detention centers just outside of our district, whether it's Hudson or Elizabeth, New Jersey, or several others. And those folks are being detained in a facility for not having committed any crime at all. They are being detained for civil infractions as well. And because coronavirus is breaking out in these facilities, they are essentially being kept in solitary confinement, where they must be kept inside of a room for 23 or 23 and a half hours per day. And you only get 30 minutes to an hour, depending on the facility, in a day in order to shower, in order to contact a lawyer, in order to call your family and let them know that you are alive. This is completely inhumane. And there are so many people that are being detained for no good reason in those incredibly dangerous and inhumane conditions. So we really need to be focusing as well in both of these, because just as a matter of principle, the detention of people in a facility where a life-threatening disease is running rampant is going to kill people, and it likely has killed people. So we need to demand all of those provisions, and we also need to demand an assessment on federal jails and prisons to make sure that we're letting as many people go as safely as possible. So thank you for your question, Brian. Let's move on to Justin from Woodside. Justin? Justin, are you still there?
Hi, sorry. Thank you.
Oh, no worries. Hey.
Thank you for taking my call.
No, of course.
So I wanted to ask you about a little bit about the upcoming presidential election in November. So first of all, I'm sure you know that Governor Newsom recently signed an executive order allowing all Californians to vote by mail in November.
Yeah.
Do you know whether Governor Cuomo has the authority to do that in New York? And if so, how can we go about convincing him to make that happen?
Yes. So please
sorry.
go.
While I have you on the here, I wanted to ask you also if you could talk a little bit about the task force that you're co-chairing with Secretary Kerry to advise Vice President Biden on climate issues. Mm-hmm. Just like how that came about, and like if you have any like goals related to that issue.
Of course. No, thank you. Thank you for both of those questions. So the first is on vote by mail in the state of New York. So when it comes to the general election, we need to double check, but according to what I know early on, I do believe that the governor has the authority to issue vote by mail here in the state of New York. Now, will he do it is a totally different question. When we have brought this up in early conversations, and I have had conversations with the governor, one of the things that he says as kind of an early rebuttal is he'll do it if Congress pays for it. And he essentially feels like he's in a position where, because there are so many cuts across the board, because tax revenue is going down, and frankly, on their end, because they're not raising taxes on the rich to cover any of that stopgap, he's basically saying that although he can, he will not do it unless he gets a check from the federal government. So the first thing that we need to do is, I think, to really start making this a more persistent issue and start organizing advocacy for it, because as we also know, this has never been done in the state of New York before. There are absentee ballots that people have been able to apply for, but applying for an absentee ballot, so first you need to get an application for an absentee ballot, mail that in or file it online. Once that's processed and approved, then you can get mailed an absentee ballot. You need to mail that absentee ballot within a very specified period of time. Point is, we've never done this before en masse in the state. And so we really need to get this operation started as early as possible. And we have a primary election coming up on June 23rd. So we have a primary election coming up next month. And this is only going to be a trial balloon for the logistical challenges and opportunities that we have in November. So we really need to get loud about it now on the state level so that we can start pushing and advancing legislation on the state level to or potentially just an executive order by the governor to make sure that everyone is mailed an absentee ballot. But at the same time, we also need to be mobilizing on the federal level to try to get those provisions at least funded so that states aren't bleeding more than they already have with the lack of revenue and the lack and just the explosion of need that we've had here in our state. So that's one thing. And how we organize to convince them to do that, I think it's going to take again, a lot of that activism, I think if journalists start asking this at his regular press conferences, this will continue to be an issue, and the heat really needs to stay on all of this, because if we don't get vote by mail in the state, it could have really terrible consequences, not just for the presidential election, but even terrible consequences on the congressional level as well. A lot of people don't know that New York has quite a few swing seats inside of it. And we need to make sure that we're mobilizing for that. On your second question about today's appointment. So for those of you who have not seen the news, I announced today that I have accepted Senator Sanders' nomination to co-chair the climate task force that would inform Joe Biden's policy as well as the policy of the entire party, along with Secretary John Kerry. That task force that we are co-chairing will have several other members of the climate movement inside it, including the founder of the Sunrise Movement, including folks like Catherine Flowers on the progressive side, who has advocated for rather social justice lenses and racial justice lenses in climate policy. But also there will also be representatives from the Biden camp, and which includes some of my colleagues in Congress, Representative Kathy Castor, who is the chairwoman of the Select Committee on Climate Change in the House, will be named to that as well. So let's rewind a little bit, because I think this is an important thing to talk about. I very much wrestled with this decision. It's not one that I made lightly, and it's not one that I took or made alone. And the reason I wrestled with it is the reason that I think a lot of progressives would wrestle with it, and that the movement would wrestle with it. You don't want to be co-opted. You don't want to be used just for appearances. And I'm not here to just kind of be entertained and just, told to move along and then essentially be ignored. And so I was concerned, and continue sometimes to approach this with some skepticism, because I am not here to be an accoutrement. I am not here to be window dressing or to be appeased to. And those were very real concerns with the establishment of any sort of panel or task force or what have you. And so I want to name that. And essentially the choice that I had was, do I say yes to this in order to get on the table and essentially try to voice people's concerns in this and to let those concerns be known? Or do I say no and walk away and just not be part of this process whatsoever? And I think there are legitimate arguments to be made on either end. But ultimately, one, I was, as many people know, a very strong supporter of Senator Sanders. And Senator Sanders believes very much that this is something that in a direction that he wants to take the campaign, and wants to make sure that we position progressive leaders as in very key positions to, at the very least, sway and push the Biden administration as much as possible to improve and better articulate progressive policy. And I think the thing that ultimately swayed me was that I convened a group of activists and folks from the movement and said, what do you think? And I think one of the things that was just kind of said was, listen, it might just be better to be in this room than not be in this room. And so I'm not here to make grand promises and say that this task force is going to change the world, because that fundamentally does not fit with my theory of change. I don't believe that change happens in panels and task forces and rooms with people with big titles. I believe that change happens in the streets, and it happens with everyday people organizing en masse. That being said, I think we also have to sometimes acknowledge the political reality that we're in, which is that Senator Sanders did not win the primary election. And after speaking, and in seeing some of the folks that he was nominating, particularly to the climate task force that I was being asked to be a part of, I didn't know who was being named to any of the other ones. I think one of the things that I saw was a genuine good faith openness in advancing climate policy. I heard an acknowledgement. I spoke with Vice President Biden. I heard an acknowledgement from him and also in who he was appointing to this committee that there was a willingness to grow. And if that is the case, I think that even if we can move it 1 inch, the existential crisis that the climate crisis represents, at this point, we need to exert maximum pressure on the outside, on the inside, while also continuing to organize maximum agitation and organizing on the outside. And so this is not about an inside-only strategy. It's about continuing pressure on the inside and actually creating that space and that organizing on the outside. And so, I think I'm trying to approach this with skepticism, but also good faith. And I told the vice president myself to expect me to push. And I think he accepted that and he knew that. And I think really what I want to pursue this appointment with is with maximum transparency into the process. And you know what? There is a gamble here. Could it lead to nothing? Sure, it could lead to nothing. Could it lead to something? Yeah, it could also lead to something. And I think that I am thankful that and I'm honored and I'm thankful that Bernie nominated and Biden both accepted my nomination as a co-chair of this. And I believe that in co-chairing this with Secretary John Kerry, that at least gives us a little bit of leverage to help drive the thing and move the thing. And so I am greatly looking forward that if there were any specific movements or outputs from this task force that our folks in our community would look at and say, okay, this is real and this is not just window dressing, I'd love to hear. Because ultimately, I'm here in service of a working class progressive movement and to advance that movement. Sometimes it means getting your hands dirty, but it never means compromising our values. And so, sometimes we're at tables and we're in rooms and we have to figure it out. And it could be it could be a waste of time. It could not be. But we'll only find out if we're there. And so I just want to be fully transparent. I'm not here to tell you this is going to solve every single problem, but I wanted to give you insight into my thought process. So thank you again so much, Justin, for both of those questions, really important. Let's see. So we are going to put some local mutual aid groups here on the screen very quickly before we move on. And our local Bronx and Queens mutual aid groups, we're throwing them up on the screen with the links. Those are the bit.lys that you may see on the screen. And those are for you all to see and connect with if you want to help our mutual aid efforts, if you need help from mutual aid efforts, if you want to donate your stimulus check, because I don't know, maybe you got it like that. I don't judge. If you want to help or if you need help in any way, shape, or form, even if it's $5 that you need or $5 to give, please connect with our mutual aid organizations. Those are the links that you see on the screen. Type them up. They're made short on purpose so that you can just plug them into the URL. And also shout out to all of our folks that are connecting through, watching us on YouTube and Facebook Live. I so appreciate you. Again, this is kind of an experimental situation that we got going on. And thanks for tuning in. We really appreciate it. So again, we're going to be doing that. And those are the links. These are mutual aid groups in Northeast Bronx, East Bronx, Jackson Heights, East Elmhurst, Astoria, Sunnyside, Woodside, Queens. This is all a testament to the organizing energy and culture that we have in our community. So thank you all so much. All right, moving on to Barbara from Corona with your question. Barbara, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, great.
Can you hear me?
For calling in. Yeah.
Oh, nice to have you.
No, thank you.
I really appreciate you doing this. Because sometimes we have an issue and we don't know who or where to address it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And with this coronavirus, no one is talking about people like me who live in a co-op.
Mm-hmm.
I'm living in a co-op here in Corona, and I don't hear co-op being mentioned when they talk about housing.
Mm.
And we have to pay our maintenance and our mortgage like any person who owns a house, although they're in an apartment.
Right.
And then the management of the building, they are asking you, not they're asking you, they're taking 2 or 3% of your tax rebate. When your rebate come back to you, rather than give people their rebate, they're taking the rebate and saying they're taking it for an assessment. This was not something that discussed, like we're going to fix the roof and we need money. We're going to fix windows. We need money. Nothing like that. But they're just taking our money. I'm a senior. And I don't think that this is right. So my main thing is, where do I go to get this address?
Well, thank you for calling in, Barbara. And thank you for asking this question, because it's very good information for me as a legislator. Because when we talk about sometimes the gaps that are made and people sometimes fall through those gaps and their needs aren't being addressed, it's stories like yours that really help me keep an eye out and say, oh, I have to address Barbara's issue in federal legislation, i.e. people who are in co-ops. And a lot of people across the country may not really understand co-ops, or even people in New York City may not understand co-ops. But it's actually, it's a very fascinating way of housing that is very, at least its origins and its origin story is very unique in New York City. But it's essentially a way that people can have essentially collective ownership in a building, and you can buy an apartment oftentimes below the current market rate, but then you also have to sell that apartment at the same, and each co-op is different, but the way that some co-ops work is that you buy it for a certain price, you also have to sell it for that same price, because that is how a lot of people can benefit from having a more affordable home. And it's essentially a rejection of this for-profit speculative way of housing. But that being said, there can often be conflicts between owners of co-ops or people in a co-op and in the management of that co-op, which is something that it seems like you're speaking to in your issue right now. So to be clear, some of the housing provisions that are already in the bill have to do with federally backed mortgages. So depending on how you financed your co-op, you could be eligible for some sort of relief, even if it's just a forbearance on payments. If a management company is starting to deduct, when you say deducting your tax rebate, do you mean like your IRS rebate that you normally get is getting deducted? Like, does it seem like they're garnishing people?
Yes, they every year you get the housing rebate, because we in co-op we pay taxes, like school taxes, so we get a star rebate and a housing rebate, just like people who own a single family home.
I see. So one of the things that we can do to get to the bottom of your issue, Barbara, is that I would encourage you, I'll pull up the phone number to my to my casework office. It may be that we may have to connect you to a legal aid group or to some sort of representation to dig into your case. Our office may or may not be able to get directly involved, but we absolutely can connect you with someone that can help you and potentially provide representation if that's something that you need. So let me pull up my my office's, my congressional office's number, because we have so many of them. I don't want to give you the wrong one. And what we can do is set you on the right path. But if someone is in fact, charging you something and taking away something from you that you have not consented to, there may be a course of action for you to take. So let me give you the phone number. Do you got a pen ready? All right. It's 718-662-5970. That is my congressional office. That's 718-662-5970. We can get started on your case. We can take all of this information about deductions, about this issue with your rent, with your management company, and we can get involved. We'll connect you with folks that can help you if you need more day-to-day representation. And if it's a larger issue, we're more than happy to if the situation indicates, we're more than happy to get involved or issue a letter if that's something that we're able to do in your given situation. So thank you so much, Barbara. Call our office. We'll put you on the right track. And just to everyone who's tuning in, whether you're tuning in on BronxNet or YouTube or Facebook Live, thank you all so much for joining us. This has been our second cafecito and conversation. So thank you all so much. Bye-bye.